This is episode 35 with Dr. Caitlin Faas.
Welcome to the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast, the show that empowers you to become the hero of your life's journey. With your host, Brian Tier.
Hey guys and girls, welcome back to another episode of the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast, episode 35 today, and I'm really excited to be speaking to none other than Dr. Caitlin Faas. Now, in case you haven't heard of her, Dr. Caitlin Faas is an assistant professor of psychology and an experienced career coach for young adults who spent the last decade or more studying a field known as emerging adulthood. Now, as a psychology professor, Dr. Faas has a great understanding of why human beings make the choices we do and why we either succeed or flounder in our attempts to create a meaningful career. Her mission is to help provide a guidance that every young adult needs to make sound career decisions that'll lay the foundations for a successful, fulfilling life. Now, this is the first time I've spoken to a doctor on the show, and I was really excited to get on a call with someone who actually studies the science behind life in our 20s. In this episode, you're going to learn how quarter lifers today differ from those in previous generations, the 5 features of emerging adulthood, the most surprising thing Dr. Faas has found in her research, how to figure out your future career, why we feel like we have to have everything figured out right now, and the first thing to do if and when you drop out of college. As always, you can get the links and resources we mentioned in the show at briantier.com/035. But for now, let's go hang out with Dr. Caitlin Faas. Welcome back, everyone, and a big welcome to today's guest. I'm speaking to Dr. Caitlin Faas. Caitlin, welcome to the Quarter Life Comeback.
Thank you, Brian, for having me. I'm so excited to be on the podcast, and a special thank you to Bailey Richard for connecting us, one of your past guests.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on, and it was so cool to meet you and interact a bit via social media before this. And before we get into the episode, why don't you tell everyone listening a bit about who is Dr. Caitlin Faas and a bit about your own quarter life story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a college professor and a career coach, and I just turned 30 this year. So I'm in kind of the group, a lot like you, Brian, a lot like Bailey. I followed this path of achievement and I'm another valedictorian in my high school. Went to college, realized I wanted to be part of academia, wanted to be a researcher, wanted to teach college. I've always wanted to be a teacher, but I was kind of like on the straight and narrow path. So I went directly from college to my PhD program and then landed a tenure track position at a small liberal arts college where I'm in my 4th year now. And so I have never left the school path. I worked along the way full time, but I have never left that path. And it's a very achievement-driven path and odd. But I'll say for my own crisis, I'd say more of my life crisis was even in the past year, recognizing that, I followed this such strict, narrow path that what does the rest of life look like? And I'm here on this other end of I have all the things I set out to accomplish. So now what? So in the past year, I've really been reflecting on how do I reach a larger audience and how do I help? I've done all of this research for over a decade now about some of the topics we're going to talk about, but how do I spread that out into the world instead of living in the ivory tower? So that's been the crisis of the year, I'd say, but it's kind of an ongoing pivot moments throughout my life as I've started to realize this. I'm also a big Jenny Blake fan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned 2 of my favorite guests already, and we've got about 2 minutes down, and we've mentioned it.
Right?
Cool. So, could you maybe tell us a bit more about what is the work you do with young adults right now before we get into the research that you've done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so being a college professor, I have I teach students in my lifespan development classes, and they come to me for advising issues. But I've recently gotten into career coaching because I see that I saw that I needed more skills than kind of what I was providing. And sometimes students were really upset, from something I had said, like, right? I can say really scary things sometimes to young adults, and we can all do that as we're trying to mentor people and coach them. But so I've been working on my certification for coaching, and I have a much more, better understanding now of approaches I can take and how I can ask powerful questions to young adults. So in the community, I talk to young adults and coach young adults on their different career paths, whether or not that involves college, and what life is like after college types of issues. So that's all of my population right now. And then I also research and conduct studies and write about young adulthood. So I go to conferences about young adults, and everybody, there's hundreds of people in the room, and we're all talking about young adults at the same time. So my day can be quite varied, from writing to working with clients to teaching students, all of those things.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall at a conference where people are talking about young adults.
Well, you can come. Oh, it's welcome. Oh, everybody, open to everybody.
So before I get on to the next topic, I just want to say how much I love the fact that, as a professor, you realized the fact that you needed to develop new skills in order to help your students. And you didn't just say, like, well, I've got my education and that's it now. But you're looking to grow to help your students as well, which I just wanted to say how much I love that. So let's talk about the research you've done now. You said about a decade, maybe more, of studying adulthood. And I think in our conversations beforehand, you called it emerging adulthood. So for people listening, I know I hadn't heard about this as a sort of standalone field of research. So for people listening, why don't you tell us a bit about what is this field of emerging adulthood?
Yes. So this is why I'm so excited to be on the podcast too, because it's such a field that it's grown in the past 16 years. The term was coined in 2000 by Jeffrey Arnett, and it's grown so much, but it still seems to live in a bubble. So Jeffrey Arnett is the one that came up with this term and has really developed it. Also a professor and a great researcher, a really great guy to talk to. So I recommend your readers go check out his original research. But to kind of talk about it, here, for our understanding, we think of emerging adulthood as part of the lifespan as a time frame between 18 years old and 29 years old, approximately. And we think of it this way, that it's something new and different because 18 to 29-year-olds now are demographically different than they were several decades ago. So they're taking all kinds of different paths to getting married and having children and buying a house and getting a job. And there's all these new combinations of things as everybody's growing up. And then they're also subjectively different during this time frame. So when we ask the question, do you feel like an adult? What would your answer be, Brian? Do you feel like an adult?
I suppose it depends on like how I look at that answer. So I feel mature and that I'm responsible and that I can make my own decisions. But then on the other hand, I can say I still feel like I'm having a lot of fun, and like a large part of my life is playing and like enjoying what I'm doing. So I think the sort of broad answer is yes, I do feel like an adult, but not in the sort of boring grown-up way that a lot of people think of adulthood.
Yes, absolutely. And that's like what you're saying is what so many people say that are in this either age span or even a little bit older too. We realize that we're saying sometimes yes and sometimes no, that's the most common answer during this time frame. But if you ask a 15-year-old, they're pretty much like, no, absolutely not. And a 35-year-old and a 40-year-old, they pretty much say, yeah, I'm an adult. Especially when you become a parent, a lot of people feel like, there are big days when I have to be an adult, especially for my child. So that's what makes it subjectively different. So what's cool about this idea that Arnett proposed was that there are 5 features to it that make it different from the other times in the lifespan. And it's not just about the markers of achievement that we kind of say as a society. So he talked about this is really a time for identity explorations. So who am I? Who do I want to be? Figuring out who we are in all these different life domains. He says it's an age of instability. So we feel like we have all these frequent moves. We might change romantic partners. You can ask emerging adults, like, where are you going to be in a year? And they say, I don't know, right? Like, I literally don't know where I might be next year. So that's different. It's also an age of self-focus. So sometimes I'd say the media and people will really try to say, like, 20-year-olds aren't paying attention to anybody except themselves. And emerging adulthood researchers kind of push back, and we say, well, because this is how we've set it up. We want them to be self-focused so that they figure themselves out and can also help others. It's also an age of feeling in between. During emerging adulthood, we kind of go back and forth between, like, here's when I feel like an adult, but when I'm back in my parents' house, I don't feel like an adult, and I have some experience under my belt, but not quite yet enough. And so going back and forth, sandwiched in between things. And then the last feature he talks about is this age of possibilities. So it's so exciting that our whole life is in front of us in emerging adulthood, but at the same time, it's really, really scary. So a lot of I guess a lot of people I talk to out and about will say things like, oh, you teach college. I miss college so much. That was such a great time period. And I say, what this indicates to me is that you don't spend time with college students, because they are so stressed out, and like being a young person is stressful and has all of these features to it that a lot of times we dismiss or we forget about as we get to the other end of being more secure or, not feeling this instability. So those are the 5 features that they talk about, kind of the gist of emerging adulthood.
Yeah, I love that. And from what you're saying, it sounds like, there's a lot of confusion and like, I don't know if I feel like an adult or a kid, but that's okay. It's like part of this stage of life is to go through that and to figure it out.
Absolutely.
And I think that stress that you mentioned, that being a college student or of that age is stressful. I think that is what people equate to the quarter life crisis. And I'd love to hear on what some of your research shows into, like, why people go through this. Is it because of those things we said now, or like what is the research saying about the term the quarter life crisis?
Yeah, well, and it's funny. I'd say I'm probably more in the camp of, should we really call it a crisis rather and define it that way? Because when we talk later about midlife crises in the lifespan, we actually try to show that not everybody has a midlife crisis and these stereotypes are really overblown. So if we really start to pick up on this term quarter life crisis, then people will start to turn to, I'm 25 and I haven't had my quarter life crisis yet. I don't know what's going on. So I guess sometimes I avoid that term, but it's absolutely part of all these issues that are happening, and realizing, I guess, that age of possibilities that so many older adults are telling us, like, if you don't explore some of these things now, you will be kind of trapped into decisions that you've made. And some of your past guests have talked about this with that Defining Decade book by Meg Jay, and kind of like we're setting the foundation. And so if you're kind of on a different trajectory or problematic trajectory, that's going to play out later in your lifespan. And so we're worried about that. The 2 researchers that have talked about this in a book that I think your readers would like, or your listeners would like to read, is called Not Quite Adults, and it's by Setterson and Ray, and they wrote it in 2010. And they try to talk to the public about some of these issues of why is it that 20-something-year-olds aren't quite adults yet. And what I like, one of the takeaways from their book, is that we are either swimming in water or treading water in our 20s. And swimming doesn't mean that you're constantly making decisions that are kind of putting you on this path, but it means that you're making progress. And it may be zigzag progress, as we all do, but it's it doesn't have to be like the one right path for you. And they call it slow or calculated progress. Compared to treading water, this is where we start to worry about young adults. If you're treading water, you're not making any traction. And, there's all kinds of water analogies to go with that. You could be sinking. You could feel like you have nowhere to go. And there's always times where we feel like we're treading water, but continuing to make progress and continuing to swim, so to speak, is what we want people to be doing in their 20s. So crisis or not, just like continuing to make some kind of progress, even if it feels like two steps forward, one step back kind of feeling, that's okay.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the zigzag progress, because it's something that Smiley Pozwalski mentions in his book and on our interview with like the lily pad analogy. And I think it was Paul Angoni said the same thing, where it's not about like the career ladder where you're on one single path or trajectory. It's like hopping from different things, and not hopping as in like changing your mind all the time. And now I want to do this and now I want to do that, but just kind of doing one thing and sort of developing skills to jump to that next thing. And I must say, I do agree with what you said about the quarter life crisis as well. I think the term, it's helpful to have a term just to kind of identify this stage of life and the phase that people go through. But I do think crisis is quite an extreme word. And when I asked Jenny, we mentioned Jenny Blake earlier, when I asked Jenny about I think I said to her, is the quarter life crisis a real thing? And she said no, which kind of surprised me because she wrote Life After College. But she explained her answer by saying that it's not a real thing because it's not just this stage of life that you're going to go through these times where you have to make some decisions and pivot, true to her book. So I like that as well. And thank you for those book recommendations. I'll definitely link those up in the show notes. Caitlin, you mentioned before we chatted about how, the stage of 25-year-olds differs from 35-year-olds. Could you maybe get into that a little bit?
So demographically, 35-year-olds, and this would be in Western industrialized countries for the most part, but we are studying it cross-culturally as well. Demographically, 35-year-olds are more likely to be married and have children. And those are two big markers that kind of change the landscape for a lot of people. They may own a home or be more settled, at least. If they don't own their own home, they're settled into their home and kind of the location that they're going to be in for a while compared to the 25-year-old. And so it's those things that set them apart. And there's less, because of all this more stability that they have, there's kind of less issues behind these, who we are, like figuring out our identity. And now we're turning to like, how am I going to be a parent? How does the concept of me fit into the rest of my life, and how does it fit into the rest of society at this point? What am I doing at work to contribute? What am I not doing? And that's part of that crisis conversation too, right? So there's plenty of 35-year-olds that are kind of looking around and saying, like what happened here? What did I do? What have I done in the past 10 years? And they're working on their pivots and kind of relaunching themselves. So, but it's going to be less so. It's kind of, emerging adulthood exists because of these demographic differences and the idea that 25-year-olds have so much more in common with each other than 35-year-olds do. Okay, because you just have more time to take different paths, really.
And what would you say is kind of the most unexpected or the most surprising thing you found in your research on emerging adulthood?
Oh, most surprising. That's a good question. Well, I guess, okay, so for my research in particular, I'm interested in people who aren't pursuing college anymore, because what we find, especially in the United States, is that so many people go to college, but the majority of people actually do not finish these bachelor's degrees that they set out to complete. And to me, especially being in a college environment, and society seems to always be promoting college. It's surprising to me how many people haven't completed that degree, and then how we're dealing with it. So I feel like there's not this place to turn to if you're somebody who dropped out of college. And dropping out has all these negative connotations with it. But what if it was actually the best decision for you? Like, what if it was the best thing you ever did? That's like not acceptable, right?
Yeah, and you end up racking up so much debt, and which further adds to your stress and
absolutely
kind of limits your decisions as well. It's if you have all this debt to pay off, you can't just like up and leave and go do something you feel like doing.
Absolutely. And that's the group that I try to help the most in my research because, what if we can prevent some of these, do you need $50,000 in debt to realize that you don't want to be at college anymore? Or could we have been having conversations with you in high school and then as you're transitioning or taking gap years and those kinds of things to have a better understanding about it? And so many of your guests have kind of talked about this debt that we accrue in our 20s, right? And why wasn't somebody saying something about it? So sometimes I get on that mission too, to say, we have to pay attention to the debt and the amount of money we're taking on. I'd say that's probably the most surprising.
Yeah. And even apart from the debt, it's not just limited to the US. I know even here in South Africa, it's kind of like seen as the way you have to do things or should do things is you finish school and you go to university or college, and there's no real like acceptable alternative or society sort of social acceptable alternative. It's just that's how things work. And I think it is something that our generation's starting to look at, and probably the next generation will be even more sort of trailblazing in this field. But I think it is something that needs to change, is like not looking down on people who don't go to college or university.
Absolutely. They're everywhere.
Yeah. So Caitlin, we spoke about your book, about some of your book recommendations, and I want to speak about your book now. It's called 30 Days to Figuring Out Your Future Career, Steps for Young Adults to Get on Track. And I'm guessing it's aimed at, like you said, people who didn't go to college, but I'm sure it could apply to anyone in this stage of their lives. What are some of those steps? I know it's kind of like a one step a day type of thing. What are some of the steps that people can take to figure out their future career or the path they want to take?
Yeah. So thanks for mentioning that. This is exciting for me because it's kind of another way, besides my research articles, it's kind of a way to share information with the general public. So some of the steps, I always, as a lifespan researcher, I step back and say, in these steps, I want you to think about your whole life and not just where your career or like the job you're going to have in 5 years. So what are some of your non-negotiables are in the steps? So what are things that, if you do not want to leave where you live currently, that's kind of a non-negotiable. So, but if somehow in your head you're kind of like, but marine biology, but you're not willing to live on the coast, right? This is kind of a clash between career and life. So kind of recognizing those steps in the beginning. It's definitely aimed at more kind of our younger group, so more 18 to 25 that hasn't had I would say future career because they haven't had a lot of experience with different types of careers. And in the steps too, I send them to a lot of links about places that you can look at careers and then how to take those steps to learn more about particular careers. And these are things we don't always teach in the college classroom even, or the university classroom. Not everybody's telling you to you could go here, you could look at this, you could talk to that person. So yeah, it's day by day broken down for everybody to make it manageable and bite-sized because it's so overwhelming in the beginning. And I want to kind of dispel those myths. It doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Yeah, I know Jenny described her Life After College book as a life coach in your pocket. And this to me sounds like a career guidance counselor or career coach in your pocket. So that I'm really going to check out that. Just for interest's sake, you said it's aimed at the younger the younger age group. Could someone who's had a little bit of career experience but looking to make a major change, could they get benefit out of reading this?
Yes, definitely. Because again, those non-negotiables that you're setting up, and then the ability to go look at different careers, especially if you want to make a large pivot, as Jenny, I love everything she writes. If you want to make a big pivot, kind of taking the steps again to realize where do you go for these things and who can I ask about career transitions. And it's broader than, I mean, anybody can Google like how to go on that job interview. That's not the kind of step that's in here, but it's the broader kind of where do I start? Where do I go from here next?
To make sure that I'm landing the right job interview.
Yes.
Cool. Well, I'm definitely going to check that out, and I'll put it in the show notes for people to check out as well. I'm curious to find out, in your research or any books you've read or people you've spoken to at some of the conferences, why is it that people in the sort of quarter life 20-something age group feel like they have to have everything figured out right now?
Yeah. Well, I'd say one, society tells us to get it figured out so that you can be successful and get out of the debt that you're accruing and those kinds of things. So society tells us to figure it out more quickly than not. And then also being in emerging adulthood is so uncomfortable. We struggle, and a lot of us are always trying to get out of the struggle. And we try to avoid the pain associated with figuring ourselves out. And that avoiding it is only going to lead to problems later, right? You're going to have to keep revisiting it. So being uncomfortable and kind of living in this space for a while is what we want, but it's so tricky and it's so hard at times. So helping each other, I think, is the biggest thing to support that not feeling alone. Like when I first found out about emerging adulthood and I was an emerging adult myself, I was just like, finally, somebody is speaking to me and I'm not alone in this. And so many of my clients or my college students feel alone. And so I say, you're not alone. Like there are so many other people struggling with this. You need to talk to them and kind of live in that space. So
yeah, and that's one of the big sort of missions of mine with this podcast, is to help people realize like it's okay not to have everything figured out. And I'm looking to sort of build up my Facebook group as kind of like a community for people to go and speak about these things. So I'll maybe mention that at the end of this.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful you're doing that, because it's sharing with everyone, and it's that community. I mean, we couldn't have done this 10 years ago, right? Yeah. And that's what's so cool about 2016.
Yeah. Caitlin, what's your sort of biggest piece of advice for people who have dropped out of college? What's like the first thing they should maybe do?
Yeah. So first thing for people who've dropped out of college, I'd say, like, who's in your support system? Do you have a strong foundation of support system? Are your parents still helping you? Do you have like a past mentor or teacher or coach that was helping you, that you can turn to for advice, kind of a foundational success? And then starting to find out what you do want to do. So who else is out there has dropped out of college? And I mean in a like very local sense, or even like online community, an actual person you can talk to, because it's very easy to say, oh, Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs, they dropped out of college, I want to be like them. But you can't talk to either of those people. So having one-on-one connections with people who have dropped out, and then seeing what their steps were to take you on your own next steps. I'm really all about intergenerational conversations. So sometimes we divide ourselves too easily between people. You know, we say like, oh, baby boomers, they don't know anything about what life is like now. They have no advice for me. I'm like, well, sometimes you got to weed through the advice because they want to talk endlessly about technology and how it's changed everything. But they still have experienced things that can be really helpful to learn from. So listening to their stories, gathering stories, listening to things like the podcast, joining a community. Some days I'm like, where's the community for college student dropouts? So
yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I really want to level up my game with this podcast and interview like a lot older guests as well, and see some of the things that they would say based on their experience, and kind of turn it into like a mentor in your ears. But I know that'll come. Caitlin, I do want to get through some sort of rapid fire questions at the end, yeah? So just the first thing that comes to your mind, and like in a sentence or two. The first one is, what do you wish you'd been told early in your 20s?
Yes. What do I wish I would have been told? So many things. But I think one of the big things is I wish somebody had said, stop saying, Caitlin, stop saying, I'll be happy when.
Mm-hmm.
Because I always said, I'll be happy when I graduate college. I'll be happy when I complete my PhD. I'll be happy when I get married. All of these I'll be happy when statements just keep us focused on the future instead of the present. And as I'm transitioning into a life where I hang streamers for baby parties, right? Like I'm at a stage where all my friends are having babies. I look back and I say, oh, like I wasn't present enough for weddings and the celebrations we had in our early 20s, or, like kind of college life. I wasn't paying enough attention because I was so focused on the future. And the future's here, and I'm still struggling with many of the same issues. So I do wish somebody had said that. And yeah.
I love it. What's the greatest opportunity for quarter lifers today?
Greatest opportunity. I think, speaking of 2016, if you want to learn something, it's possible. And maybe that's what's so cool about being not having to follow a straight academic path. That even if you want to learn how to code, or you want to learn how to build that thing, or how to fix that, or play guitar, all of these things, you can just learn it from YouTube and reaching out to other people. And those are some of the things I really wished I had when I was 10 or 15. And so being able to have everything right there to learn, and that's obviously coming from a college professor. Like I can't help to say, read books and learn more.
I love it. All right, this next question's kind of a meta question. So listen close. It's, if this had to become wait, let me ask it this way. What would I need to ask you at the end of this interview in order for this to become the most important thing for young adults to hear? And how would you answer that?
Okay. Yeah, the most important thing to ask, I think the question is, for your listeners, it's like, what are you searching for? And I say that because I think in my 20s, I was searching for happiness. It was like, I just wanted to be happy all the time. And now that I'm 30, I feel like I'm searching for different things. And you kind of like, was that really what I wanted? Or are there other things like experiencing love? And I have a good book for you, Brian, about Love Warrior by Glennon Doyle Melton. I know you're a fan of Brene Brown already and being vulnerable. So that's kind of like tying into that. Like, what are you searching for and how are you going to answer that? Because if it's money, that's putting you on a very different path. And if it is happiness, that's putting you on a different path. And if it's achievement, right? So that kind of, it's almost a headlight in the distance for what are you searching for? It's going to pull you in a certain direction in your 20s.
I love it. Caitlin, I've got one more question, but before I get to that, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they go to do so? And feel free to mention anything else you're working on right now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. So everywhere on social media and my website is at Dr. Caitlin Faas. And so that's DrCaitlinFaas. So that's 2 A's in the middle. And so Twitter, emailing me, it's on my website, going to Amazon for the book. The home base is really my website, drcaitlinfaas.com. So my favorite thing is to read emails back or read comments from people. So I love the engagement. So please, if you listen to this, reach out to me. Let's start a conversation.
I love it. And you're the first doctor I've interviewed on the show. So you've got
fascinating. Fascinating. Well, yeah, I'm sure more will come out of the woodwork now and you'll get a big variety.
Yeah, here's hoping. Dr. Caitlin Faas, before I get on to the final question, I just want to acknowledge you for coming on today and sharing a bit about your story and your research and wisdom, and for realizing that, as a professor, there were still skills that you needed to develop in order to help your students fully, and for taking the steps to sort of further your own development in your own career, while helping other people develop theirs as well, and showing that there is a light and a path and a possible journey beyond just going to college. So I want to acknowledge you for that. It's really awesome work that you're doing. And the final question that I have is, what one thing can listeners do this week to start creating their own quarter life comeback?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. This has been such a joy. I think the one thing is, if you feel excitement and energy from this podcast, channel that energy, because I know when I listen to podcasts or talking on podcasts, I get so excited, right? Mm-hmm. And then I get distracted and I forget what I'm doing. But channel this energy and say, like, what am I going to do this week? What am I excited about? What's like one thing I can do this week to make progress? So channel your energy and share it with others.
Take action. I love it. Dr. Caitlin Faas, thank you so much for coming on the Quarter Life Comeback.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
So there you have it, guys and girls. That wraps up this week's episode of the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast, episode 35. And a big thanks once again to Dr. Caitlin Faas for coming on the show and sharing some of her research and discoveries on emerging adulthood. Such a cool topic. If you liked this episode, please share it around with your friends and shoot me a tweet at Brian Tier and let me know some of your biggest takeaways. For me, it was definitely the idea that we don't have to create or know what we want to create right now. And, this is a time for identity explorations, as Caitlin put it. Now, as always, you can catch the links and resources we mentioned in the show at briantier.com/035 and head on over to quarterlifecomeback.com to subscribe to get all these episodes as soon as they come out. Thanks again for spending time with me this week, and until next time, keep creating your quarter life comeback.
Thanks for listening to the Quarter Life Comeback. Get started today by visiting briantier.com.